Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we savor the wisdom of timeless books over a warm cup of coffee. Today, we embark on a journey through Confessions by Saint Augustine. The fact that you're here, choosing to delve into this profound work, speaks volumes about your curiosity and commitment to personal growth. While others might be tempted by the endless scroll of social media or the next binge-worthy series, you've chosen a path of reflection and understanding. Confessions is a book like no other, an introspective exploration that delves deep into the mind and soul. It's a narrative of transformation, a roadmap of the human experience, and a reflection on faith, truth, and the complexity of human nature. Though we may not have specific endorsements from modern figures like Bill Gates or Obama, Augustine's work has been revered by countless philosophers, theologians, and scholars throughout history for its depth and insight. Saint Augustine, a towering figure in Christian history, wrote Confessions as an autobiographical reflection of his spiritual journey. Born in North Africa in 354 AD, Augustine led a turbulent life filled with temptations and questions that ultimately led him to a profound conversion to Christianity. His personal struggles, intellectual pursuits, and eventual embrace of faith shape this deeply personal narrative. Now a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A journey from sin to redemption. Saint Augustine, born in 354 AD in North Africa, navigated a life of intellectual exploration and moral struggles before converting to Christianity, shaping his confessional narrative. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's lived an extraordinary life, someone who's seen the darkest depths of human nature and emerged with profound wisdom. That's exactly what we get in the opening of Augustine's Confessions, one of the most honest and psychologically penetrating autobiographies ever written. Augustine doesn't start with his greatest achievements or his spiritual awakening. No, he begins with something far more unsettling and relatable, the sins of a baby. Now think about this for a moment. When you look at a newborn, what do you see? Most of us see innocence, purity, perhaps the image of God untainted by the world. But Augustine, writing in the 4th century, sees something entirely different. He watches infants and notices their fierce jealousy when another child nurses, their violent tantrums when they don't get what they want, their complete self-centeredness. He's not being cynical here. He's being brutally honest about human nature from its very beginning. Augustine tells us about his own infancy with remarkable psychological insight. He describes how even as a baby, he would throw fits of rage when adults didn't understand his wordless demands. Picture a modern toddler having a complete meltdown in a grocery store because they can't have candy, and you'll understand exactly what Augustine is getting at. The child isn't evil, but there's something there, something that shows our natural inclination towards selfishness runs deeper than we might want to admit. But here's where Augustine's genius really shines through. He's not just observing childhood behavior, he's asking fundamental questions about human nature that still keep philosophers and psychologists busy today. Are we born good and corrupted by society, as many modern thinkers suggest? Or is there something more complex happening? Augustine argues that even in our most innocent state, we carry within us the seeds of every sin we'll ever commit. This might sound depressing, but Augustine finds it liberating. Think about it this way. If you've ever wondered why you keep making the same mistakes, why you struggle with the same character flaws year after year, Augustine is saying it's not because you're uniquely broken. It's because you're human. We all start from the same place of fundamental neediness and self-centeredness. Augustine then moves into his early childhood, and here's where his storytelling becomes absolutely captivating. He remembers learning to speak, not through formal instruction, but through desperate desire to communicate his wants and needs. Watch a toddler today learning language, and you'll see exactly what he means. They're not just acquiring vocabulary, they're gaining power, the ability to manipulate their environment to get what they want. He describes his early education with a mixture of gratitude and frustration that any student can relate to. He loved stories, especially the epic tales of heroes and gods, but he hated the grammar lessons and rote memorization. Sound familiar? Augustine is essentially describing every student who ever daydreamed through math class while devouring fantasy novels under their desk. But here's his insight. He was learning to love beautiful lies while resenting difficult truths. This leads to one of the most famous episodes in all of literature, though it happens later in his youth. Augustine's reflection on childhood sets up his understanding of how small moral compromises lead to larger ones. He's building a case that our character is formed through countless tiny choices, most of which we don't even recognize as moral decisions at the time. What makes Augustine's analysis so powerful is how he connects these childhood experiences to larger spiritual truths. He sees in his infant jealousy the same pride that would later drive his academic ambitions. He recognizes in his childhood preference for entertaining stories over difficult lessons the same pattern that would lead him to pursue philosophy and rhetoric, while ignoring the deeper questions of how to live well. Now you might be thinking, isn't this a bit harsh? After all, we're talking about normal child development here. But Augustine isn't condemning childhood or suggesting children are evil. Instead, he's making a profound point about self-awareness. Most of us go through life thinking our problems started when we hit adolescence, or when we face some particular trauma or challenge. Augustine suggests they started much earlier, in the very structure of human desire itself. This perspective offers surprising comfort for anyone struggling with personal growth. How many times have you promised yourself you'd change some habit or pattern, only to find yourself right back where you started? Augustine is saying this isn't a personal failure, it's a human condition. The solution isn't to try harder with willpower alone, but to recognize how deep our need for transformation really goes. Augustine's exploration of childhood also reveals his remarkable gift for psychological observation. 1,500 years before modern psychology, he's describing patterns that researchers today recognize as fundamental to human development. His insights about language acquisition, moral formation, and the relationship between desire and learning remain surprisingly relevant. As we prepare to follow Augustine through the rest of his journey, his analysis of childhood provides the foundation for everything that follows. He's showing us that the struggles we face as adults, our capacity for both great good and terrible evil, aren't accidents or aberrations. They're the natural development of tendencies that were present from our very first breath. This sets the stage for understanding why his eventual transformation required not just moral effort, but something much more profound, something that could address the very roots of human nature itself. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's decided to tell you absolutely everything about their life, holding nothing back. That's exactly what Augustine does in Book 2 of his Confessions, and honestly, it gets pretty uncomfortable. But here's the thing about uncomfortable truths. They're usually the ones we need to hear most. Augustine is now diving headfirst into what he calls his adolescent desires. And if you've ever been a teenager or known one, you're about to recognize some painfully familiar territory. But Augustine isn't just sharing teenage drama for shock value. He's peeling back the layers of human nature itself, asking questions that are as relevant today as they were 16 centuries ago. So Augustine is about 16 years old, living in the ancient city of Carthage, which was basically the Las Vegas of North Africa, a place where everything was available and very little was off-limits. Think of a modern college town during spring break, but with Roman bathhouses and gladiator fights. Augustine describes himself as being in love with love itself, which is such a perfectly adolescent thing to say, isn't it? He's not even in love with a particular person. He's intoxicated by the very idea of passion, of feeling something intense. Now think about this for a moment. How many of us have been there? That desperate hunger for experience, for something that makes us feel alive and adult and significant. Augustine captures this universal adolescent restlessness with startling honesty. He talks about walking the streets of Carthage, his heart foul with lust, seeking experiences that would make him feel like he was finally living. It's like he's describing someone endlessly scrolling through social media, looking for that next hit of excitement or validation. But here's where Augustine's insight becomes razor-sharp. He realizes that what he was really seeking wasn't pleasure itself. It was a kind of escape from the ordinary constraints of life. He wanted to feel powerful, autonomous, free from rules and expectations. Sound familiar? Every generation of teenagers has felt this same magnetic pull toward rebellion, toward proving they're not bound by their parents' values or society's expectations. Augustine tells the famous story of stealing pears from a neighbor's tree, and at first you might think, really, we're talking about fruit theft. But stay with him here because this isn't about pears. Augustine and his friends didn't steal because they were hungry. They had better fruit at home. They didn't steal because they needed the money. They stole for the sheer thrill of doing something forbidden. They threw most of the pears to the pigs afterward. This is Augustine's genius insight. The real corruption wasn't in wanting something good in the wrong way. It was in wanting something precisely because it was wrong. Think about how this plays out today. The teenager who shoplifts not because they can't afford something, but because they want the adrenaline rush. The college student who cheats on an exam they could have passed honestly, just to see if they can get away with it. The adult who has an affair not because their marriage is terrible, but because the secrecy itself is intoxicating. Augustine calls this motiveless malignity, evil for evil's sake. It's a chilling recognition that sometimes we're drawn to destructive choices not despite their wrongness, but because of it. We want to prove we can break the rules, that we're not bound by conventional morality. It's rebellion as its own reward. But Augustine doesn't stop at psychological analysis. He's asking deeper questions about human nature itself. Why are we wired this way? Why does forbidden fruit taste sweeter? Why do we sometimes want things precisely because we're told we shouldn't have them? He's probing the mystery of what he calls original sin, not just individual bad choices, but something fundamentally skewed in human nature itself. Now you might be thinking, this sounds pretty pessimistic, and Augustine can seem harsh in his self-judgment. But here's what's beautiful about his honesty. He's not writing this as a teenager. He's looking back from middle age with the wisdom that comes from having lived through these experiences and found something better. He's like someone who's recovered from an addiction, able to see clearly the patterns that once controlled him. What Augustine discovers is that all these adolescent desires, for pleasure, for autonomy, for significance, were actually distorted versions of legitimate human longings. We do need pleasure, but the deepest pleasure comes from connection rather than consumption. We do need freedom, but true freedom isn't the absence of all constraints. It's the ability to choose what's genuinely good for us. We do need to matter, but our significance doesn't come from proving we can break rules. It comes from discovering our place in something larger than ourselves. This is where Augustine's ancient wisdom speaks directly to our contemporary struggles with instant gratification, social media validation, and the constant pressure to prove ourselves through our choices. He's showing us that the restless energy of adolescence, that hunger for more, for something real and significant, isn't something to be crushed or ignored. It's something to be redirected toward what can actually satisfy it. As we move deeper into Augustine's journey, we'll see how this brutal honesty about his adolescent struggles becomes the foundation for a completely transformed understanding of what human beings are really searching for. Sometimes, you have to get completely lost before you can find your way home. Picture this scene with me for a moment. You're 19 years old, away from home for the first time, living in the big city of Carthage. You've got questions burning inside you about life, about truth, about what really matters. Sound familiar? Well, this is exactly where we find Augustine in Book 3 of his Confessions. And honestly, his journey through this intellectual and spiritual wilderness feels remarkably similar to what many of us experience when we're searching for our place in the world. Augustine arrives in Carthage hungry for answers. Think about the last time you felt that deep, gnawing need to understand something bigger than yourself. Maybe it was during college, or after a major life change, or perhaps during one of those 3 a.m. moments when you're staring at the ceiling wondering what your life is really about. Augustine felt that same restless energy, but instead of scrolling through social media for answers, he dove headfirst into philosophy and what seemed like the most intellectually satisfying religious movement of his time. Now, here's where things get interesting. Augustine encounters something called Manichaeism, and before you tune out thinking this is just ancient history, stick with me because this story has everything to do with how we search for truth today. The Manichaeans presented Augustine with what seemed like the perfect solution to all his burning questions. They claimed to have rational, scientific explanations for everything. They promised wisdom without requiring blind faith. They said, essentially, we can prove everything to you logically. Does this sound familiar? It should, because we're surrounded by similar promises today. Think about how we approach truth-seeking in our modern world. We want data, we want proof, we want everything explained in neat, logical packages. Augustine was drawn to Manichaeism for exactly these reasons. Here was a group that seemed to offer intellectual sophistication, that appeared to solve the problem of evil in the world through their dualistic system of good and evil forces constantly at war. It was like finding a philosophical theory that explained everything from climate change to personal suffering to cosmic purpose, all wrapped up in one tidy system. But here's what Augustine discovered, and this is where his story becomes incredibly relevant to us today. The Manichaeans talked a big game about reason and proof, but when you really pressed them on the details, when you asked the hard follow-up questions, their system started to crumble. Augustine spent years, nearly a decade, waiting for their promised proofs, waiting to meet their great teacher Faustus, who was supposed to have all the answers. When Faustus finally arrived, Augustine realized the man was eloquent and charming, but ultimately couldn't deliver the intellectual goods he'd promised. Now, think about this in terms of our own truth-seeking journeys. How many times have we been attracted to ideas, influencers, or movements that promise to explain everything? Whether it's a particular political ideology, a self-help guru, a scientific theory, or even a spiritual teacher, we're constantly encountering people who claim to have figured it all out. Augustine's experience with Manichaeism is like a masterclass in intellectual discernment. He shows us what happens when we dig deeper, when we refuse to accept surface-level explanations, when we insist on real substance behind the attractive packaging. What's particularly fascinating is how Augustine describes his gradual disillusionment. It wasn't a sudden revelation that Manichaeism was wrong. Instead, it was like slowly realizing that the designer jeans you saved up to buy aren't actually any better made than the regular ones. They just have a fancier label. The cracks appeared gradually. The promised explanations never materialized. The rational proofs turned out to be clever-sounding arguments that couldn't withstand serious scrutiny. But here's the beautiful part of Augustine's story during this period. Even though he eventually became disillusioned with Manichaeism, his time with them wasn't wasted. This search, this intellectual wrestling, this willingness to commit deeply to a path of inquiry, even one that ultimately led to a dead end, was actually preparing him for the deeper truths he would later discover. It's like how sometimes you have to date the wrong person to really understand what you're looking for in a relationship, or how you might need to work in the wrong career to clarify what kind of work actually fulfills you. Augustine's journey through Manichaeism teaches us something crucial about the search for truth. Real wisdom often requires us to be wrong first, to fully commit to paths that don't work out, to experience the disappointment of ideas that seemed perfect but couldn't deliver. This isn't failure, it's education. Every intellectual dead end, every guru who disappoints us, every theory that falls apart under examination, is actually teaching us to recognize authentic truth when we finally encounter it. As we watch Augustine navigate this period of seeking, we see someone who refuses to settle for easy answers, even when those answers are temporarily satisfying. He models for us what it means to be genuinely curious, genuinely committed to truth rather than just to being right or feeling superior. His willingness to eventually admit he was wrong about Manichaeism, after years of investment, shows us the kind of intellectual humility that real wisdom requires. This sets us up perfectly for what comes next in Augustine's journey, where his hard-won skepticism and his refined ability to distinguish between genuine and superficial wisdom will serve him well as he encounters ideas and people who can actually deliver on their promises of truth. So we've been journeying through Augustine's remarkable confessions together, watching this brilliant but restless young man stumble through his 20s, chasing after everything except what his heart truly needed. And now, in Book 4, we encounter one of the most raw and honest explorations of grief ever written. Picture Augustine at 26, living back in his hometown of Thagest after his time in Carthage, teaching rhetoric and still caught up in his Manichaean beliefs. He's surrounded by friends, enjoying what he thinks is the good life, when suddenly death crashes into his world like a thunderbolt. Augustine had a friend, someone so close that they seemed like two souls sharing one life. He never tells us this friend's name, which somehow makes the story even more universal, doesn't it? This could be any of us losing someone we can't imagine living without. They had grown up together, gone to school together, shared the same interests, the same age, the same flowering of youth. Augustine describes their friendship in language that's almost romantic in its intensity. They delighted in the same things, he tells us. When one spoke, the other listened with complete attention. They were, in his beautiful phrase, sweet to each other. Now think about this for a moment. Haven't we all had friendships like that? Those bonds that feel unbreakable, where you finish each other's sentences, where you can't imagine your world without that person in it. Augustine captures something so fundamentally human here about the intensity of young friendship, that feeling that you and your closest friend are invincible together, that nothing could ever come between you. But then his friend falls ill with a fever. In those days before modern medicine, a fever could be a death sentence, and this one proves to be exactly that. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn. While his friend is unconscious, burning with fever, his family has him baptized as a Christian. Augustine almost dismisses this, thinking his friend will laugh about it when he recovers. After all, they had both been caught up in Manichaean teaching, skeptical of Christianity. But when his friend briefly regains consciousness and Augustine jokes about the baptism, something unexpected happens. His friend rebukes him seriously, asking him never to speak that way again. Augustine is stunned. This wasn't the response he expected from his closest companion. But before they can explore this change further, before Augustine can process what has happened to his friend's heart, the fever returns, and within days, his friend is dead. Just like that. Gone. The person who had been half of Augustine's world simply vanished. What follows is one of the most honest descriptions of grief you'll ever encounter. Augustine doesn't try to be noble or philosophical about it. He tells us exactly how it felt. Everything that had brought him joy now brought only pain. His hometown became a torture chamber because everywhere he looked, he expected to see his friend. Every familiar place screamed with his absence. The very light of day became hateful to him. He wept constantly, and those tears, he says, became his only comfort. Listen to how he describes it. My heart was black with grief. He couldn't understand how other people could be alive when his friend was dead. He couldn't understand how he himself could go on living when the better half of himself had died. He felt like he was carrying around a wounded soul that didn't want to be carried, yet he couldn't put it down because there was nowhere else for it to go. Doesn't this capture something we've all felt in moments of profound loss? That sense that the world should stop, that it's almost offensive that life continues as normal when your world has been shattered. Augustine is showing us that even the most brilliant minds, even future saints, experience grief in all its messy, irrational intensity. But here's where Augustine's honesty becomes even more striking. He realizes that his grief has become a kind of misery that he's actually enjoying. He's in love with his own sadness. The tears feel good because they're the only connection he has left to his friend. He's afraid to heal because healing feels like betrayal, like letting go of the last thread that binds him to what he's lost. This insight is absolutely crucial for anyone who's experienced deep grief. Sometimes we hold onto our pain because it feels like holding onto the person we've lost. Augustine sees this clearly in himself and recognizes how destructive it is. He's made an idol of his grief, turned his sorrow into a kind of god that demands constant worship through tears and despair. The only thing that eventually helps him is leaving Thagest entirely. He can't heal in the place where every stone and tree reminds him of his friend. So he moves to Carthage, and gradually, very gradually, time and new friendships begin to ease the raw wound in his heart. But he learns something profound from this experience about the nature of human love and attachment. Augustine realizes that he had loved his friend as if he would never die, as if their friendship was eternal and unbreakable. But because he loved a mortal thing as if it were immortal, when death revealed the truth, his heart was devastated. He sees now that any love that doesn't ultimately point toward the eternal, toward God, is doomed to end in this kind of anguish. This doesn't mean Augustine thinks human friendship is worthless. Far from it. But he's beginning to understand that our hearts are made for something infinite, and when we try to find that infinity in finite things, even beautiful finite things like friendship, we set ourselves up for inevitable heartbreak. This wisdom speaks directly to our modern struggles with attachment, doesn't it? We live in a culture that often treats human relationships as the ultimate source of meaning and happiness, and then we're devastated when they inevitably disappoint us or end. Augustine is pointing toward a different way of loving, one that treasures human bonds while recognizing their proper place in the larger story of our soul's journey toward God. As we move forward in Augustine's story, we'll see how this painful lesson about love and loss becomes a crucial step in his spiritual development, preparing his heart for the ultimate relationship his soul has been seeking all along. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone you've deeply admired, someone whose words have shaped your entire worldview for nearly a decade. You've built your identity around their teachings, defended their ideas passionately, and found comfort in their explanations of life's biggest mysteries. But now, as you finally meet them face to face, something feels terribly wrong. Their answers feel hollow, their wisdom shallow, and you're left wondering if everything you've believed has been built on sand. This is exactly where we find Augustine in Book 5 of his Confessions, and honestly, it's one of the most relatable spiritual crises ever recorded. We're watching a brilliant young man grapple with the slow, painful realization that the belief system he's clung to for years might be fundamentally flawed. And if you've ever questioned a deeply held belief, lost faith in a mentor, or wondered if you've been living a lie, Augustine's journey through skepticism and doubt will feel achingly familiar. Augustine had been a Manichaean for about 9 years by this point. Now think about this for a moment. 9 years. That's longer than most people stay at a job, longer than many relationships last. The Manichaeans had given him what felt like scientific answers to life's biggest questions. They promised rational explanations for evil, for suffering, for the nature of reality itself. No need for blind faith, they said, just pure logical truth. But cracks were starting to show. Augustine was asking questions that his local Manichaean teachers couldn't answer. They kept promising him that when the great Faustus arrived, all would be made clear. Faustus was their celebrity bishop, their intellectual heavyweight, the man who could supposedly demolish any argument against their faith. Augustine waited eagerly for this encounter, like someone today might wait to meet their intellectual hero at a conference or book signing. When Faustus finally arrived in Carthage, Augustine was ready with his list of burning questions. But what happened next was devastating in its disappointment. Faustus was charming, eloquent, and well-spoken, but when it came to the deep philosophical and scientific questions that troubled Augustine, the man was utterly out of his depth. It was like discovering your favorite podcast host doesn't actually understand the topics they discuss so confidently, or realizing that influencer you follow is just really good at sounding smart without actually knowing much. Augustine describes this moment with such painful honesty. He recognized that Faustus was a better speaker than other Manichaean teachers, but when it came to the subjects Augustine cared about most, Faustus knew less than Augustine himself. Imagine the crushing weight of that realization. The person you've been told has all the answers doesn't even understand the questions. This experience launched Augustine into a period of profound skepticism that many of us will recognize. Have you ever had that moment where you suddenly question everything you thought you knew? Maybe it was discovering that a trusted news source had been misleading you, or realizing that advice you'd followed for years was actually harmful. That's the territory Augustine was entering, and it's terrifying because once you start questioning one fundamental belief, everything else becomes suspect. Augustine began to doubt not just Manichaeism but the very possibility of finding truth at all. He started gravitating toward the academic skeptics, philosophers who argued that certain knowledge was impossible to achieve. This wasn't just intellectual curiosity for Augustine, it was an existential crisis. If we can't know anything for certain, how do we live? How do we make decisions? How do we find meaning? Think about how relevant this is to our current moment. We live in an age of information overload, where experts contradict each other, where alternative facts compete with established science, where social media algorithms create echo chambers that make us question what's real. Augustine's struggle with skepticism speaks directly to our contemporary crisis of truth. He was grappling with questions we're still wrestling with. How do we distinguish between genuine knowledge and attractive falsehoods? What do we do when the authorities we've trusted let us down? But here's what's fascinating about Augustine's approach to this crisis. He didn't just retreat into cynical relativism or give up the search for truth entirely. Instead, he became more careful, more discerning. He learned to hold his beliefs more lightly while still remaining open to genuine wisdom wherever it might come from. It's like learning to be a more sophisticated consumer of information, developing better filters for truth without becoming completely closed off to new ideas. During this period, Augustine also made a crucial practical decision. He decided to leave Carthage for Rome, partly to escape his unruly students, but also to seek new opportunities and perspectives. Sometimes a change of environment is exactly what we need when we're stuck in old patterns of thinking. Rome represented possibility, a chance to encounter new ideas and new people who might help him navigate his crisis of faith. Augustine's journey through skepticism wasn't just about losing his religion. It was about learning to think more critically, to ask better questions, and to recognize the difference between genuine wisdom and intellectual showmanship. His disillusionment with Manichaeism wasn't the end of his spiritual journey, but a necessary clearing of the ground for something more authentic to grow. As we'll see in the chapters ahead, this period of doubt and questioning wasn't a detour from Augustine's path to truth. It was an essential part of it. Sometimes we have to lose our certainties to find something more solid to stand on. Picture this. You're at a crossroads in your life, maybe questioning everything you thought you knew about success, meaning, or even God. You've been running on intellectual pride for years, thinking you've got it all figured out, when suddenly you meet someone who completely shifts your perspective without even trying. That's exactly what happened to Augustine when he encountered Bishop Ambrose in Milan, and honestly, It's one of the most fascinating turning points in spiritual literature. Augustine arrives in Milan in 384 AD, not as some humble seeker of truth, but as a hotshot professor of rhetoric. Think of him as the ancient equivalent of a TED Talk speaker who's absolutely convinced of his own brilliance. He's been a Manichaean for 9 years, following this dualistic religion that promised to explain everything through reason and logic. But here's the thing about intellectual arrogance. It's incredibly fragile when it meets genuine wisdom. Now, Augustine didn't go to hear Ambrose preach because he was spiritually hungry. No, he went as a professional critic, like a food blogger visiting a restaurant specifically to write a scathing review. He wanted to study Ambrose's rhetorical techniques, maybe pick up some professional tips, and probably find flaws in the bishop's arguments. But something unexpected happened. He got completely blindsided by the content rather than just the style. Think about this for a moment. How often do we approach new ideas with our minds already made up? Augustine thought he knew everything about Christianity from his childhood exposure to his mother Monica's faith, and he dismissed it as intellectually inferior. But Ambrose was different. Here was a man who could match Augustine's intellectual firepower while possessing something Augustine desperately lacked: genuine spiritual depth and peace. What made Ambrose so compelling wasn't just his eloquence, though he was undoubtedly gifted. It was his approach to Scripture that revolutionized Augustine's thinking. The Manichaeans had taught Augustine to read the Bible literally and then mock its apparent contradictions and primitive stories. But Ambrose introduced him to allegorical interpretation, showing how these ancient texts contained layers of meaning that spoke to the human condition in profound ways. Imagine Augustine's shock when Ambrose explained that when Genesis says humans are made in the image of God, it doesn't mean God has a physical body like ours, but rather that we reflect God's spiritual nature. Suddenly, all those crude anthropomorphic descriptions of God that had driven Augustine away from Christianity began to make sense in a completely different framework. It's like discovering that a book you thought was poorly written science fiction was actually sophisticated metaphor all along. But here's what really gets to the heart of Augustine's transformation. Ambrose embodied what he preached. This wasn't just academic theology or empty rhetoric. Augustine observed how this bishop lived, how he treated people, how he carried himself with genuine humility despite his enormous learning and influence. In our age of social media personas and carefully curated public images, there's something refreshing about encountering someone whose private character matches their public presentation. Augustine describes watching Ambrose read silently, and this detail is more significant than it might seem. In the ancient world, reading was typically done aloud, but Ambrose would sit quietly, his eyes moving across the page while his voice remained still. Augustine was fascinated by this, wondering what thoughts occupied the bishop's mind during these silent encounters with sacred texts. There's something beautiful about this image. A man so absorbed in divine truth that he needed no external validation, no audience for his spiritual practice. Now think about this. Augustine is watching someone who has what he desperately wants but doesn't yet understand. Ambrose possessed intellectual satisfaction without arrogance, spiritual certainty without fanaticism, and most importantly, genuine peace. Augustine had been chasing happiness through career success, philosophical systems, and even romantic relationships, but here was someone who seemed to have found something deeper and more lasting. The irony is delicious when you consider it. Augustine came to Milan to advance his career and maybe impress the imperial court with his rhetorical skills. Instead, he encountered someone who made him question whether his entire life trajectory was fundamentally misdirected. It's like going to a networking event to climb the corporate ladder and meeting someone who makes you realize you've been climbing the wrong building entirely. What's particularly striking about Augustine's account is how he describes the gradual nature of this influence. Ambrose didn't deliver some knockout argument that instantly converted Augustine. Instead, week after week, sermon after sermon, Augustine found his intellectual objections to Christianity crumbling. The bishop's patient, thoughtful approach to Scripture began to reveal depths Augustine had never imagined possible. This sets up perfectly what's coming next in Augustine's journey, the growing tension between his intellectual acceptance of Christianity's truth and his inability to fully commit his will to following it. Ambrose had shown him that Christianity could satisfy his mind, but Augustine was about to discover that knowing the truth and living it are two very different challenges. Sometimes the most dangerous moment in any spiritual journey isn't when we're fighting against the truth, but when we're convinced by it, yet still hesitating to fully embrace its implications for how we live. Picture this: you're sitting in a coffee shop scrolling through your phone when suddenly you stumble across an article that completely changes how you see the world. That moment of intellectual breakthrough, that sudden clarity where everything clicks into place, that's exactly what Augustine experiences in Book 7 of his Confessions. But instead of a random internet article, his revelation comes through wrestling with some of the deepest questions humanity has ever asked. What is evil? What is God? And how can we truly know anything at all? Now think about this for a moment. Augustine has been searching for truth his entire adult life. He's tried the Manichaeans with their dramatic cosmic battle between light and darkness. He's flirted with skepticism, wondering if we can know anything for certain. He's even dabbled in astrology, looking to the stars for answers. But here in Book 7, something profound happens. His mind finally breaks through to a new understanding of reality itself. The journey begins with Augustine grappling with what philosophers call the problem of evil. You know how sometimes people ask, if God is all good and all-powerful, why is there suffering in the world? Well, Augustine was wrestling with this exact question, and it was eating him alive. The Manichaeans had given him what seemed like a neat answer. There are two gods, one good and one evil, locked in eternal combat. Evil exists because the evil God creates it. Simple, right? But Augustine's brilliant mind starts picking this apart. He realizes something crucial. Evil isn't actually a thing that gets created. Think of it like darkness. Darkness isn't something that exists on its own. It's simply the absence of light. When you flip on a light switch in a dark room, you're not destroying darkness, you're adding light. Augustine has this incredible insight that evil is like darkness. It's not a substance or a creation, but rather a corruption, a turning away from good. Imagine you have a perfectly good apple. When it rots, the rottenness isn't some foreign substance that invades the apple. The rot is simply the apple's goodness breaking down, corrupting, moving away from what it was meant to be. This is Augustine's revolutionary understanding of evil. It's not something God created, because God only creates good things. Evil is what happens when good things turn away from their proper purpose, when they become corrupted or misdirected. But Augustine's intellectual conversion goes much deeper than solving the problem of evil. He encounters the writings of the Platonists. Think of them as the ancient world's most sophisticated philosophers. And through them, he begins to understand God in a completely new way. Up until this point, Augustine had been thinking of God as some kind of physical being, maybe very large and powerful, but still essentially material. The Platonists blow his mind by introducing him to the concept of spiritual reality, the idea that the most real and important things aren't physical at all. Now, here's where Augustine's experience becomes incredibly relatable to our modern world. Have you ever tried to explain love to someone? You can't point to it, weigh it, or measure it with instruments, yet love is arguably one of the most powerful forces in human experience. Augustine realizes that God is like this, not a physical being you could theoretically bump into, but pure being itself, the source of all existence, more real than anything physical precisely, because everything physical depends on this spiritual reality for its existence. Augustine describes an incredible moment of mystical insight where he feels his mind ascending, step by step, beyond the physical world. He moves from contemplating material things to considering the life that animates them, then to the mind that thinks about life, and finally to the unchanging truth that illuminates the mind. It's like climbing a ladder of reality. and at the top, he catches a glimpse of God as eternal, unchanging truth itself. But here's the thing that makes Augustine so honest and relatable. This mystical moment doesn't last. He describes it beautifully. He was able to see the goal but not yet able to stay there. It's like finally reaching the summit of a mountain you've been climbing for years, getting a breathtaking view of the landscape below, but then realizing you don't yet have the strength to build a permanent camp at that height. The vision was real, the insight was genuine, but Augustine recognizes he still lacks something essential for making this understanding a permanent part of his life. This is where Augustine's intellectual conversion reveals its limitations. His mind can now conceive of God properly. He understands that God is spiritual, not material. He grasps that evil is corruption rather than creation. He solved major philosophical problems that had been troubling him for years, but knowing something intellectually and being able to live it are two very different things. It's like knowing that exercise is good for you versus actually getting up every morning to go for a run. Augustine realizes that while his intellect has been converted, his will remains divided. He can see the truth, but he can't yet fully embrace it. This sets up the dramatic tension that will carry us into the next phase of his journey, the famous struggle in the garden where his will finally catches up with his intellect, where knowing the good finally becomes doing the good. But that's a story for our next conversation, as Augustine continues his remarkable journey from intellectual understanding to complete transformation of life. Picture this. You're sitting in a beautiful garden on a warm afternoon, and suddenly your entire life changes forever. That's exactly what happened to Augustine in what might be the most famous garden scene in all of literature, and trust me, it's nothing like the romantic garden scenes you see in movies. We've been following Augustine's journey through his restless searching, his philosophical wanderings, and his deep inner turmoil about who he really wanted to become. By Book 8, he's intellectually convinced that Christianity is true, but he's stuck in what we might call today an epic case of decision paralysis. You know that feeling when you know exactly what you should do, but you just can't seem to make yourself do it. Augustine was living in that space, and it was tearing him apart. Think about the last time you stood at a major crossroads in your life. Maybe it was leaving a comfortable but unfulfilling job, ending a relationship that wasn't working, or finally committing to that dream you've been putting off. You probably experienced what Augustine describes so brilliantly in this section, the war between two wills. He writes about having one will that wanted to serve God completely and another will that was attached to his old life, his old habits, his old identity. These two wills weren't just disagreeing, they were literally tearing his soul in half. Augustine uses this incredible metaphor of being chained by the iron links of his own will. Imagine being imprisoned, but the crazy twist is that you're both the prisoner and the jailer. The key to your freedom is right there in your hand, but some part of you keeps refusing to turn it. This is exactly what Augustine was experiencing with his sexual desires and his attachment to worldly success. He knew these things were keeping him from the life he truly wanted, but breaking free felt impossible. Now think about this. How many of us are walking around today as prisoners of our own habits? We know we should exercise more, spend less time on social media, be more present with our families, pursue that creative project we keep talking about, but we remain chained by what Augustine calls the iron bondage of our own will. His struggle is remarkably modern, isn't it? The garden scene itself unfolds like a psychological thriller. Augustine is with his friend Alypius in a garden in Milan, and he's reached his absolute breaking point. He's been hearing stories about other people who made dramatic life changes, like the story of Antony of Egypt, who heard a gospel reading and immediately gave up everything to follow Christ. These stories are like daggers to Augustine's heart because they highlight his own inability to make the leap. Suddenly, Augustine can't take it anymore. He throws himself down under a fig tree and begins weeping uncontrollably. This isn't just crying. This is the kind of soul-deep sobbing that comes when years of internal pressure finally explode. He's asking God why there has to be such a delay, why he can't just decide and be done with it. Have you ever felt that frustration with yourself, that anger at your own hesitation when you know what needs to be done? Then comes the moment that changed everything. Augustine hears a child's voice from a neighboring house chanting, "Take up and read, take up and read." Now, this might have been just a children's game, but Augustine takes it as a divine sign. He rushes back to where he'd left a copy of Paul's letters, opens it randomly, and his eyes fall on Romans 13:13-14. Let us walk honestly, as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. But put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh, to fulfill the lusts thereof. Here's what's absolutely fascinating about this moment. Augustine doesn't hear a voice from heaven or see a miraculous vision. Instead, he encounters truth through a book, through words on a page. In our age of information overload, there's something beautiful about the idea that the right words, encountered at exactly the right moment, can change everything. How many of us have had that experience of reading something that felt like it was written specifically for us? The transformation is immediate and complete. Augustine describes it like darkness suddenly giving way to light, like all his doubts and hesitations simply vanishing. The war between his two wills is over because one will has completely surrendered to the other. He's not just intellectually convinced anymore, he's emotionally and spiritually committed. What strikes me most about Augustine's conversion is how it combines the deeply personal with the universal. On one hand, this is his unique story, a specific man in a specific garden at a specific moment in history. But on the other hand, it's the story of anyone who's ever struggled with making a difficult but necessary change in their lives. The garden scene teaches us that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not through gradual progress, but through moments of complete surrender. Augustine had been trying to change gradually, to ease into his new life while holding onto pieces of his old one. But real change, he discovered, required letting go completely. As we move forward in Augustine's story, we'll see how this garden moment becomes the foundation for everything that follows: his baptism, his ministry, his incredible influence on Christian thought. But perhaps most importantly for us today, we'll see how one moment of authentic surrender can redirect an entire life toward purpose and meaning. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who has just experienced the most transformative moment of their entire life, and they're trying to find the words to tell you what it feels like to be completely reborn. That's exactly where we find Augustine in Book 9 of his Confessions, and honestly, his joy is so infectious that even across 16 centuries, you can almost feel the excitement radiating from every page. Augustine has finally made it to the baptismal font, but the journey to get there reads like the most beautiful love story ever written. Think about those moments in your own life when everything suddenly clicked into place, when all the scattered pieces of your identity finally formed a complete picture. Maybe it was meeting your life partner, or discovering your true calling, or having that breakthrough moment in therapy where everything made sense. Augustine's baptism carries that same energy, but magnified to cosmic proportions. What strikes me most about this section is how Augustine describes the weeks leading up to his baptism. He's not rushing headlong into this decision like someone caught up in emotional fervor. Instead, he's like a person who has been wandering in a maze for years and finally found the exit, but now wants to savor every step toward freedom. He spends time in retreat with his mother Monica, his son Adeodatus, and his closest friends, creating what we might call today an intentional community focused on spiritual growth and intellectual exploration. Now, think about this for a moment. Here's a man who had spent decades chasing after fame, fortune, and fleeting pleasures, and suddenly he's choosing to step away from all of that to focus on prayer, study, and deep conversation with the people he loves most. In our hyperconnected, always-on world, doesn't that sound almost revolutionary? Augustine was essentially doing a digital detox 1500 years before we had digital devices to detox from. The retreat itself becomes this beautiful microcosm of what Augustine believes the Christian life should look like. They spend their days reading scripture, discussing philosophy, writing, and supporting each other's spiritual growth. It's like the ultimate book club meets meditation retreat meets family therapy session. Augustine describes these months as some of the happiest of his life, and you can sense why. After years of internal conflict and restless searching, he's finally found peace not just with God, but with himself and his relationships. But here's where Augustine's honesty really shines through. Even in the midst of this spiritual high, he doesn't pretend that all his struggles have magically disappeared. He's still wrestling with questions, still feeling the pull of old habits, still figuring out what this new life is supposed to look like practically. It's refreshingly real, isn't it? How many times have we seen people claim that faith or therapy or a new relationship has solved all their problems overnight? Augustine is telling us that transformation is both instantaneous and gradual, both a moment of decision and a lifetime of growth. The actual baptism scene is described with such tender detail that you feel like you're standing right there in the ancient church. Augustine, his son Deodatus, and his friend Alypius all receive baptism together on Easter Sunday in Milan. Can you imagine the emotion in that room? Monica, who had prayed for her son's conversion for decades, watching him emerge from those waters as a new creation. Augustine himself, feeling the weight of his past sins literally washed away, stepping into an identity he had been running from for most of his adult life. What I find particularly moving is how Augustine describes the community aspect of this moment. Baptism isn't just a private transaction between him and God. It's his official welcome into a family of believers who will support him, challenge him, and walk alongside him for the rest of his journey. In our increasingly isolated modern world, there's something deeply appealing about that kind of radical belonging, isn't there? Augustine also reflects on how this new life changes his relationship with his intellectual pursuits. He doesn't abandon his love of learning and philosophical inquiry, but now everything is reoriented around this central truth he's discovered. It's like someone who has been studying individual puzzle pieces for years, suddenly seeing how they all fit together to create a magnificent picture. His mind, which had been scattered across a dozen different philosophical schools and competing worldviews, now has a unifying center that makes sense of everything else. The practical implications start showing up immediately. Augustine begins planning a life of service, considering how to use his gifts of teaching and writing in service of this new community he's joined. He's not retreating from the world, but engaging with it from a completely different foundation. Instead of seeking personal glory through his rhetoric and teaching, he's now asking how his talents can serve something greater than himself. As Book 9 draws to a close, Augustine is preparing to leave Milan and return to Africa, but he's returning as a fundamentally different person than the one who left years earlier. The restless seeker has become a joyful finder, the scattered intellectual has become a focused servant, the lonely striver has become part of a beloved community. This transformation Augustine describes isn't just ancient history. It's a template for anyone who has ever felt the deep human longing for meaning, purpose, and authentic connection. Whether your own turning point involves religious faith or something else entirely, Augustine's journey reminds us that real change is always possible, and that our greatest struggles often prepare us for our most beautiful beginnings. You know, we've been walking alongside Augustine through his wild journey of transformation, and now we arrive at what might be the most psychologically profound section of his entire work. Picture this: Augustine, now a mature bishop, sitting in the quiet of his study, turning his attention inward like a detective examining the very machinery of his own mind. Book 10 is where Augustine becomes the world's first great psychologist, 1500 years before Freud ever picked up a pen. Think about this for a moment. When was the last time you really examined how your memory works? Augustine opens this section with an almost childlike wonder at the vast palace of his own mind. He describes memory as this incredible storehouse, bigger than any cathedral or library you could imagine. But here's what's fascinating about Augustine's approach. He's not just marveling at memory as some abstract concept. He's using it as a launching pad to understand something much deeper about confession and our relationship with God. Augustine starts by asking himself a question that should stop us all in our tracks. What's the point of confessing to God if God already knows everything about us? It's like trying to surprise someone who can read your mind. But Augustine realizes something profound here. Confession isn't for God's benefit, it's for ours. When we articulate our struggles, our failures, our deepest longings, we're not informing God of anything new. We're doing something much more important. We're finally being honest with ourselves. Now think about how this plays out in your own life. How often do we go through our days on autopilot, never really examining what's driving our choices? Augustine suggests that memory is like having access to our own personal database of experiences, emotions, and knowledge. But here's the kicker. We don't always know what's stored in there, and we certainly don't always understand how it influences us. Augustine tells us about wandering through what he calls the fields and spacious palaces of memory. Imagine walking through an endless mansion where every room contains different categories of your life experience. One room holds all your mathematical knowledge, another contains every song you've ever heard, and yet another stores every face you've ever seen. But then Augustine stumbles upon something unsettling. There are rooms in this mansion that he didn't even know existed. Memories hiding in shadows, experiences that shaped him in ways he never realized. This is where Augustine's exploration becomes almost uncomfortably modern. He's essentially describing what we now call the unconscious mind. He talks about how certain memories can be triggered by the smallest things, how emotions from decades ago can suddenly flood back with startling intensity. Sound familiar? How many times have you caught a whiff of your grandmother's perfume and been instantly transported back to childhood, feeling emotions you thought you'd forgotten? But Augustine goes deeper. He realizes that memory isn't just about storing the past, it's actively shaping who he is in the present moment. Every decision, every reaction, every preference is influenced by this vast archive of experience. And this leads him to a troubling recognition. If he doesn't fully understand his own memory, how can he truly know himself? And if he doesn't know himself, how can his confession to God be complete? Here's where Augustine's psychological insight becomes spiritual wisdom. He recognizes that there are parts of himself that remain hidden even from his own conscious awareness. He talks about the abyss of human consciousness and admits that there are depths within himself that he cannot fathom. This isn't false humility, it's radical honesty about the limits of self-knowledge. Think about the implications of this for a moment. In our age of self-help and personal optimization, we often assume that with enough introspection and effort, we can fully understand and control ourselves. Augustine suggests something more humble and, paradoxically, more liberating. Complete self-knowledge might be impossible for human beings. We need something beyond ourselves to truly see who we are. This is where Augustine's exploration of memory intersects with his understanding of God. He suggests that God knows us better than we know ourselves, not because God is some cosmic spy, but because God sees the totality of who we are, including those hidden chambers of memory and motivation that we can't access. Confession becomes not just an admission of wrongdoing, but a vulnerable acknowledgement that we need help understanding ourselves. Augustine also grapples with something that feels incredibly contemporary, the relationship between knowledge and transformation. He knows what's right, he understands moral principles, he can articulate truth with eloquence and precision. But knowledge alone doesn't change behavior. How many of us have experienced this frustration? We know we should exercise more, eat better, be more patient with our families, spend less time on social media, but knowing and doing remain stubbornly separate. This gap between knowledge and action leads Augustine to one of his most profound insights about human nature. We are not simply rational beings who occasionally act irrationally. We are complex creatures driven by desires, memories, and motivations that often operate below the level of conscious awareness. Real transformation requires more than just new information. It requires a fundamental reorientation of our deepest loves and longings. As we close this exploration of Augustine's inner world, we're left with questions that echo across the centuries into our own coffee-stained, smartphone-lit lives. What hidden influences are shaping your choices today? What would change if you approached self-understanding with Augustine's combination of rigorous honesty and humble recognition of your own limits? And perhaps most importantly, are you ready to confess not just your obvious failures, but your need for help understanding the very mystery of who you are? You know, there's something beautiful about sitting with a cup of coffee and pondering the mysteries that have puzzled humanity for centuries. We've been walking with Augustine through his remarkable journey of transformation, and now we arrive at what might be the most mind-bending section of his entire Confessions. Book 11 takes us deep into Augustine's wrestling match with time itself, and trust me, this isn't just ancient philosophy gathering dust on a shelf. This is the kind of thinking that will change how you experience your next Monday morning commute. Picture Augustine in his study, maybe late at night with an oil lamp flickering, turning over in his mind a question that had been nagging at him. Someone had asked him, probably with a smirk, "So Augustine, what was God doing before he created the world? Was he just sitting around being bored?" It's the kind of smart-aleck question that seems designed to trip up anyone claiming to understand divine mysteries. But instead of getting defensive, Augustine does something brilliant. He dives headfirst into the nature of time itself. Now think about this for a moment. When you woke up this morning, you probably checked your phone for the time, maybe rushed to make coffee before your first meeting, planned what you'd do later tonight. We live our entire lives swimming in time like fish in water, completely surrounded by it. Yet when someone asks us to explain what time actually is, we stumble. Augustine puts it perfectly. If no one asks me, I know what it is. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. Isn't that wonderfully honest? We're all experts on time until someone asks us to define it. Augustine begins to unpack this mystery by examining our common way of talking about time. We say the past, present, and future as if they're three equal territories on some cosmic map. But here's where it gets fascinating. Augustine realizes that the past doesn't actually exist anymore. Think about your breakfast this morning. Where is it now? It's gone, existing only in your memory. And the future? Well, your dinner tonight doesn't exist yet. It's just anticipation, planning, maybe a little anxiety about what you'll cook. So what about the present? This gets even stranger. The moment I say now, it's already slipping into the past. The present seems to have no duration at all. It's like trying to grab a handful of water. So if the past is gone and the future isn't here yet and the present has no real duration, where exactly is time? Augustine makes a revolutionary discovery. Time, he realizes, exists in the mind. We have memory of things past, attention to things present, and expectation of things future. Time isn't some external container we move through like passengers on a train. Time is the very structure of consciousness itself. When you remember your childhood home, you're not somehow reaching back into a place called the past. You're experiencing memory now, in this present moment of consciousness. This insight transforms everything. Have you ever noticed how time seems to crawl when you're waiting for important news, but flies by when you're absorbed in something you love? Augustine would say that's because time is intimately connected to the life of the mind. When we're anxious, our attention is scattered between memory and expectation, making each moment feel stretched and heavy. When we're fully present and engaged, our consciousness is unified, and time seems to flow naturally. But here's where Augustine's genius really shines. If time is a feature of created minds, then God, who is eternal and unchanging, doesn't experience time the way we do. God doesn't have a before and after. God doesn't wake up Monday morning wondering what happened over the weekend. For God, everything is present in one eternal now. It's like the difference between reading a novel page by page, experiencing the story unfold in time, versus the author who holds the entire story in their mind simultaneously. This means that question about what God was doing before creation misses the point entirely. There was no before creation because time itself was created along with everything else. It's like asking what's north of the North Pole. The question assumes something that doesn't exist. God didn't create the world in time. God created time along with the world. Now you might be thinking, this is all very interesting, Augustine, but what does it have to do with my actual life? Here's where it gets practical and beautiful. If time is the structure of consciousness, then how we experience time depends largely on the quality of our attention. When Augustine talks about his restless heart finding rest in God, he's describing a transformation in how he experiences time itself. Instead of being scattered across regrets about the past and anxieties about the future, he's learning to be fully present to the eternal that breaks into each moment. This has profound implications for how we live. Think about those moments when you've been completely absorbed in something beautiful or meaningful. Maybe watching a sunset, having a deep conversation with a friend, or being lost in music. In those moments, time seems to stop, doesn't it? You're experiencing a tiny taste of what Augustine calls eternity, not as endless time, but as time transcended as pure presence. As we prepare to journey with Augustine into his final reflections, we carry with us this stunning insight. We are creatures suspended between time and eternity, memory and hope, restlessness and rest. The mystery of time isn't just an intellectual puzzle. It's the very fabric of our existence, the stage on which our search for meaning plays out. You know how sometimes you'll read a passage from the Bible or hear a sermon, and suddenly 3 different people will walk away with 3 completely different interpretations. And maybe you've wondered who's right. Well, Augustine wrestles with this exact question in Book 12 of his Confessions, and what he discovers might surprise you. Picture Augustine, now in his 50s, sitting with the opening lines of Genesis spread before him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. He's not just reading these words as a casual believer anymore. He's a bishop, a theologian, someone who spent decades thinking about the deepest questions of existence. And yet, as he stares at these ancient words, he realizes something profound. Even the most fundamental truths can be understood in multiple ways, and that's not a bug in the system, it's a feature. Think about this for a moment. When Moses wrote about creation, was he describing literal 24-hour days? Was he speaking metaphorically about spiritual creation? Was he talking about the creation of matter itself, or the formation of an already existing substance? Augustine looks at these questions not with the anxiety of someone who needs to find the one right answer, but with the wonder of someone discovering that truth might be bigger than any single interpretation. Here's where Augustine gets really interesting. He starts talking about what he calls the heaven of heavens, this realm that exists beyond time and change, where God's truth dwells in perfect stillness. But then there's our world, the world of time and matter and constant flux. It's like the difference between looking at a mountain from a helicopter versus hiking through its valleys. Both perspectives show you the mountain, but they reveal completely different aspects of its reality. Augustine uses this beautiful metaphor of water to describe the state of things before creation. He talks about the deep mentioned in Genesis as being like water that has no form, no boundaries, no definition. Now think about water for a second. Pour it into a cup and it becomes the shape of a cup. Pour it into a vase and it takes on that form instead. The water itself hasn't changed, but its expression has been completely transformed. That's how Augustine sees creation, not as God making something from nothing, but as God giving form and meaning to what was previously formless and void. But here's where it gets really practical for us today. Augustine realizes that when we read these ancient texts, we're not just trying to figure out what happened billions of years ago. We're trying to understand how God works in our lives right now. When your life feels formless and chaotic, maybe you've lost a job, or a relationship has ended, or you're facing a health crisis, you're experiencing your own version of that primordial deep. And just as God spoke form into formlessness at the beginning of time, God can speak meaning into the chaos of your Monday morning. Augustine also tackles something that feels incredibly modern, the question of interpretation itself. He acknowledges that smart, faithful people can read the same text and come to different conclusions. Rather than seeing this as a problem, he sees it as evidence of how rich and multifaceted truth really is. It's like looking at a diamond. Depending on which angle you view it from, you'll see different colors and patterns, but you're always looking at the same precious stone. This insight feels revolutionary even today. In our polarized world, where everyone seems convinced that their interpretation is the only valid one, Augustine offers a different model. He suggests that truth is big enough to encompass multiple perspectives, as long as those perspectives are grounded in love and humility rather than pride and the need to be right. Now, think about this in terms of your own relationships. How often do you and your spouse or your friend experience the same event but remember it completely differently? Augustine would say that both of your memories might contain genuine truth, even if they seem contradictory on the surface. The goal isn't to prove who's right, but to understand how both perspectives reveal something important about reality. Augustine also explores the idea of time itself during creation. He grapples with the question of what it means for God to create, in the beginning, when God exists outside of time altogether. It's like trying to understand how a novelist relates to the story they're writing. The novelist exists outside the timeline of the story, but every moment within the story depends completely on the novelist's creative act. Similarly, God's creative work isn't something that happened once upon a time. It's the ongoing foundation that makes every moment of time possible. As Augustine winds through these deep philosophical waters, he keeps coming back to something beautifully simple. The purpose of all this exploration isn't to win theological arguments, but to draw closer to God. He's not trying to solve creation like a puzzle, but to contemplate it like a work of art that reveals the heart of the artist. This brings us to a crucial transition in Augustine's spiritual journey. Through wrestling with these questions about creation and interpretation, he's learning to hold mystery and certainty in the same hand. He's discovering that faith doesn't require having all the answers. It requires trusting that the questions themselves are leading him somewhere good. And that somewhere is toward an even deeper exploration of how God's creative work continues in the human heart, which sets the stage perfectly for the final movement of his Confessions. Picture this. You're sitting with Augustine in his study in Hippo, North Africa, around the year 400. The oil lamps are flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and this brilliant mind is wrestling with perhaps the most profound mystery of his faith. After 12 books of confessing his sins, exploring memory, time, and creation, Augustine now turns to something that would challenge theologians for centuries to come. How can God be three persons yet one being? How does the Trinity work, and what does it tell us about the unity of everything God has made? Now think about this for a moment. We live in a world obsessed with division. Democrat versus Republican, us versus them, East versus West. Yet Augustine, in Book 13 of his Confessions, is grappling with the ultimate unity question. How can diversity and oneness coexist? It's like asking how a symphony can be both many instruments and one beautiful piece of music, or how a marriage can be two people becoming one flesh while remaining distinct individuals. Augustine begins this final book by reflecting on the Spirit of God hovering over the waters in Genesis. But he's not just doing biblical commentary here. He's asking a question that haunts every human heart. What brings order out of chaos? What transforms the formless void of our lives into something beautiful and meaningful? For Augustine, The answer lies in understanding how the Trinity works together in perfect unity. Let me paint you a picture of how Augustine sees this. Imagine a master craftsman's workshop, but instead of one person working alone, there are three artisans who share one mind, one heart, one vision. The Father is like the architect, conceiving the grand design. The Son is like the master builder, bringing that vision into reality. The Holy Spirit is like the breath that animates everything, the creative force that makes it all come alive. Yet they're not three separate workers. They're one creative force expressing itself in three distinct ways. Augustine uses the metaphor of love to help us understand this mystery. Think about when you truly love someone. There's the lover, that's you. There's the beloved, the person you love. And there's love itself, the bond that connects you. Three distinct realities, yet one experience. This, Augustine suggests, gives us a glimpse into how the Trinity operates. The Father loves, the Son is beloved, and the Holy Spirit is the love that flows between them. It's not three gods loving each other. It's one God who is love itself, expressing that love in three persons. But here's where Augustine gets really practical. He doesn't leave this as some abstract theological puzzle. He connects it to how we live, how we love, how we find meaning. You see, if God exists in perfect unity while maintaining distinct persons, then diversity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a reflection of divine nature. Think about your own relationships. The best marriages, the strongest friendships, the most effective teams, they all share this quality. Distinct individuals united by a common purpose, a shared love, a unified vision. Augustine takes this further when he explores how all creation reflects this Trinitarian unity. The material world, with its incredible diversity of plants, animals, landscapes, and peoples, isn't chaos. It's a symphony of unity in diversity. Every sunset, every flower, every human face reflects something of the Trinity's nature. Distinct, beautiful, yet part of one magnificent whole. Now, consider how this applies to our modern struggles with identity and belonging. We live in an age where people feel torn between being authentic individuals and being part of something larger than themselves. Augustine would say this tension is actually divine. We're created in the image of a God who is both perfectly unified and beautifully distinct. Our longing to be ourselves while also belonging to community isn't a design flaw. It's a reflection of our Creator's nature. Augustine also addresses something that feels incredibly contemporary. How do we find unity without uniformity? In our polarized world, we often think unity means everyone thinking exactly the same way. But Augustine's Trinity shows us a different model. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not identical copies of each other. They have distinct roles, distinct personalities, if you will, yet they share one essence, one will, one love. This suggests that true unity comes not from erasing differences, but from aligning around shared purpose and love. There's a beautiful moment where Augustine reflects on how the Spirit brings order to chaos, light to darkness, meaning to confusion. He's essentially describing what happens in every human life when we align ourselves with divine love. Think about times in your own life when everything felt scattered and purposeless, and then something shifted. Maybe it was falling in love, finding your calling, or simply experiencing a moment of profound peace. Augustine would say that's the Spirit hovering over the chaos of your life, bringing form and beauty to what seemed formless and void. As we reach the end of Augustine's Confessions, we see that this exploration of the Trinity isn't just theological speculation. It's the culmination of his entire journey from restless seeking to peaceful rest in God. The unity he finds in the Trinity becomes the pattern for understanding everything else. How body and soul work together, how reason and faith complement each other, how individual purpose and community good align, how time and eternity intersect. Augustine leaves us with a profound truth. We are created for unity, but not the kind that erases who we are. We're created for the kind of unity that celebrates our uniqueness while binding us together in love. In a world still struggling with these very questions, Augustine's insights about the Trinity offer not just theological understanding, but a roadmap for living in harmony with others and with ourselves. In Confessions by Saint Augustine, we explore the profound journey of a man's transformation from a life of indulgence and doubt to one of faith and understanding. Augustine's introspective narrative delves into themes of sin, grace, and redemption, offering timeless insights into the human condition. Throughout his Confessions, Augustine candidly shares his struggles with desire, his pursuit of truth, and ultimately his path to finding peace in God. Here are some key takeaways that you can apply to your own life. 1. Embrace vulnerability. Augustine's openness about his flaws is a testament to the power of vulnerability in personal growth. Start incredibly small by sharing a challenge you're facing with a trusted friend. This openness can pave the way for deeper connections and self-acceptance. 2. Seek truth relentlessly. Augustine's journey was fueled by an unyielding quest for truth. Challenge yourself to question your assumptions and be open to new ideas. Dedicate a few quiet moments each week to reflect on your beliefs and seek out perspectives that challenge you. 3. Accept grace. Augustine learns that grace is not earned but received. Be patient with yourself and recognize that it's okay to need help from others. Accept support when offered and forgive yourself for past mistakes. 4. Prioritize inner peace. Augustine ultimately finds solace not in external achievements but in inner tranquility. Start by setting aside a few minutes daily for meditation or prayer to cultivate a sense of calm and focus. 5. Reflect and grow. Augustine's Confessions are a powerful reminder of the importance of reflection. Take time each month to journal about your experiences, focusing on what you've learned and how you've grown. This practice can help guide your future actions and decisions. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.